Hi, I'm Steve Buchmann, and I'm a pollination ecologist from the University of Arizona. Um, I grew up liking insects. I started in the third grade collecting caterpillars and raising them. I eventually went to the California State University, Fullerton in Southern California, got a bachelor's and master's working on the biology of buzz pollination. Later, I went up to the University of California at Davis and continued those studies. And today I'm still very, very active in two departments at the University of Arizona, entomology and ecology and evolutionary biology, not only doing my own research, but advising master's and PhD students as well.
At what point did you kind of become aware of the disconnect in how they operate between like different species of bee, where the honeybee is introduced, and when you find it in the wild, it's feral, but where some native bees can be very solitary. When did you make that kind of discovery and connection?
Yeah, that was pretty much, again, as an undergraduate at Cal State Fullerton. Um, and the main person I met at that point was John Alcock, who was already quite famous at that point in the zoology department at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. And he had a long history of investigating the male reproductive strategies of wasps and bees. And he was working on a bee that I continue to work on to this day, big gray, fast flying bee, Centris pallida, which is a pollinator of our Palo Verde trees, the genus Parkinsonia. And so we had several study sites along the Colorado River on both the California and Arizona sides, where we had located huge nesting aggregations of these bees. And to this day, I have some, monitor some in the Tucson area and up near Phoenix as well. And these can be, you know, hundreds of thousands of bees, female bees nesting in sandy soil over quite a large area. And then they dig a shallow nest, really only about 5 centimeters or so, maybe 5 to 10 centimeters deep. And each female will go out and make dozens, if not more, trips to provision a small number of cells, actually only 1 to 2 brood cells in her nest, bringing back Palo Verde pollen and nectar, maybe a little bit of creosote or mesquite, but fairly specialized on desert legumes. And then um, these bees have an annual cycle, very typical for a lot of the solitary bees in the Sonoran Desert, so that the adults are only out active and alive for about a month. The males die off pretty quickly after mating, and then the females go on to provision these nests. There's no contact with between the female and her offspring, so the it's pretty much like stocking a pantry. We call this mass provisioning, so that the female puts all the pollen and nectar food in there that the larva will need. Larva eats like crazy, goes through 4 or 5 molts, pupates, may or may not spin a cocoon, and these resistant cells, brood cells, remain underground with the bees in their little claustrophobic homes, you know, until next spring, when factors that may include temperature, um, who knows, the same environmental triggers that cause the plants, their food host plants, to bloom are somehow picked up by the bees. I had a crazy thought last year that I would like to prove, although it would be very difficult to research it, but I'm wondering if there's actually some chemical communication between plant roots and bees in their cells, maybe some kind of mycorrhizal thing. Who knows? That's a really wild idea, but might be happening. We don't know.
Very cool. All right. And then, so you've been studying bees for a fair amount of time. How has our understanding of ground nesting ecology changed since when you started?
In some ways, the the nesting biology of these solitary bees is still a kind of a black box. I mean, I can't generally go out and say, okay, it's a nice sunny day. I'm going to go out and find a nest site of Coletes or Megachile or Andrena or Centris or Anthophora. Pretty much stumble onto them serendipitously. In fact, typically these days when I want to find some of these bees, and some of them that I work on, unfortunately move their nest sites every year, we think to escape a heavy parasite load, either from kleptoparasitic bees like cuckoo bees that are going after them, or bombyliid bee flies, or wasps known as mutilids, velvet ants, or fungi. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff, a lot of microbiome that can hit, a lot of pathogenic fungi, for example, that can go after bees, as well as these predators and parasites. I do have some bees that I work on, like Centris cockerelli, for example. I've been studying one nest site for about 12, 15 years. It's in the same spot. But generally, I'm now putting out the word on social media, uh, through Facebook and other things, through local museums and volunteer naturalist programs, so that when a hiker comes across one of these bees, they can take a photograph or a video clip of it with their cell phone and post it or send it to me directly. So really, most of my legwork to find these bee nest sites anymore is not my legwork. It's tapping into all those other eyes and ears out there. And I guess that's what you guys are trying to do now with GNBee, which is a fantastic program.
And one of the things we've been thinking about a lot with Project GNB, and I'm sure you've thought about, is finding these aggregations or solitary nests a numbers game where it's just if enough people are kind of aware and looking, or is it more of a yes, here are some things we can do as scientists to help build up community science and have them be effective in the field.
Yeah, I think it is largely a numbers game in finding these nest sites. Um, as a scientist, as a single scientist, sort of semi-retired, although I'm doing more publishing and research now than I ever did when I was working. um, it's really serendipitous. These bees are either these solitary ground nesting bees are either building nests that are widely scattered, and if that's the case, it's almost impossible to find them, or fortunately, some of them will nest in these dense aggregations. That's not to say that the females are helping each other. They're not. Each female is doing her own thing. Um, and they don't get help from their mates, who are usually dead by that time, or their sisters or other unrelated kin that may be nesting in that aggregation. I like to call these solitary bees single moms with families to feed, right? So no father around, and they're doing their own thing. They've got to dig their own nest, find a good place with the right soil texture, the right proximity to food plants, dig their own nest or nests, and provision those cells, and do it in a um, efficient manner, and be able to collect these floral resources, nectar, pollen, sometimes resins or leaf pieces if you happen to be a megachilid leafcutter bee. And it all has to come together nicely, or you can have gross failures of these individual nests or nest sites. So you can have local extinctions, but we really need a lot of eyes on the ground to be able to go out and find these things. So through programs like GNBee and others, bee scientists like myself are really calling upon dedicated amateurs, naturalists, citizen scientists, call these people whatever you want. They're out there, they're interested, and you know, with almost any cell phone now, if you're out at a site, even a fairly remote site off a trail, you can click on an app and get the lat longe, the GPS coordinates, and those can be reported back along with a photograph. As you know, iNaturalist is really great with people chiming in to identify plants and animals, sometimes within hours, certainly within days of someone posting something. Another good one that I like is Bug Guide, um, and that's a great one where people, not just for pollinators, but other insects, can post photos and get very good feedback. I know, for example, Dr. John Asher at the Singapore University uh, is on Bug Guide, and a lot of them really quickly, and using his expertise to identify things to family, genus, and species. So yeah, a lot of people involved with this, and the more of these databases we can build up, the better for everyone.
I
Sorry,
agree.
I'm probably making these answers too long.
No, no, I agree 100%. I was looking for my next question to ask. Um, I'm sure this is something that a lot of like naturalists are considering, especially since ground nesting bees can have a field season of when you would find them. How will these frequently increasing abnormal, turning normal weather events that are that are caused by climate change impact um, ground nesting bee ecology?
The issues we're seeing with climate change certainly pose a potentially severe problem for ground nesting bees, right? Their host plants have to be in perfect sync with when the females emerge, they mate, and then they go and dig a nest and then start provisioning it with pollen and nectar or leaf pieces or sand or resin, various materials. And as we've seen with a number of other things, like through programs like the National Phenology Network and others, like they have their Project Bud Burst, spring is happening earlier all over the country. Um, we see this as having a detrimental effect on nesting birds, for example. So if birds, let's say, are migratory and they're coming into an area where they expect a lot of new leaves and caterpillars and use those caterpillars as food for um, their nestlings. These are happening and they're becoming disjunct, not in synchrony. And although there's not a lot of data for bees, there are a few indications that um, bees can be emerging out of sync with their host plants. So this is just going to get worse and worse.
I guess that's where naturalists can really, and community science can really come in to be handy because they'll be able to be that eyes on the ground.
Right. Yeah. So many um, people out there hiking, bird watching. I mean, watching other insects has become popular. There's like the North American Butterfly Association, NABA. Uh, people go butterflying, so they're not catching butterflies in nets a lot anymore, although that's scientifically valid. But they're identifying them through, let's say, close focusing binoculars, which actually work great for bee watching too. So you can get a pair of um, close focusing binoculars and look at, enjoy, and identify bees on flowers without really disturbing them.
I like that recommendation. That's really helpful. Um, all right. And ground nesting, one of the things, because I'm not an entomology major, I'm the more broad environment and sustainability major here at Cornell. And so it's been a lot of crash course in learning about bees for me. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that ground nesting was not confined to a single evolutionary branch, but was found in a bunch of different ones. Can you, would you care to explain how the behavior of ground nesting kind of evolved and why it's so plentiful?
Certainly, most of the world's 20, 21,000 species of described bees are ground nesting, although there are cavity nesting and twig nesting bees as well. Um, we think that perhaps ground nesting was the first uh, thing that bees did, and then they branched out into other microhabitats, that sort of thing. One thing I like to think about uh, lately, within the last only 5 to 10 years, an interesting hypothesis is that bees, well, we've known that bees are basically vegan wasps, except for the 10% that have partial meat eating tendencies when they are cuckoo bees and they chow down on their hosts. But let me start over with that. Okay. So in the history of bees, what we now think happened is that bees evolved from a very particular group of small wasps, the amoplanines. And these were and always have been hunting for thrips. And if you're a gardener, you probably like, oh, my rose bushes are being destroyed by these thrips. Um, they're pollen feeding, and they can also rasp with their weird mouth parts on the cells of flowers like roses and others. But these amoplanines, even back in the Cretaceous, had, as they were feeding on these thrips, the tiny straw-colored thrips were covered in pollen. So the wasps were getting both kinds of food, both animal and plant protein. So we think that these proto bees basically gave up on the thrips prey and just, hey, nectar and pollen is pretty tasty stuff. So just went off in that direction. Although, as I said, about 10% of the world's bees are actually at least partially carnivorous with the cuckoo bees. And then about 5 species or so in Panama and Brazil and Costa Rica are the famous vulture bees discovered by David Rubik. And these bees actually feed on carrion, so feed on dead toads or lizards. Can often find them in the tropics feeding on roadkill. So they masticate the tissue on this carrion and then regurgitate salivary enzymes, digest it, and then bring these things back into the nest. And then, but they're basically feeding their larvae on something that would be akin to hypopharyngeal gland secretions, kind of like royal jelly in the honeybee. So, yeah, so we've got some strange bees out there, from normal, hardworking ground nesting bees to evil, lurking cuckoo bees waiting for an opportunity when a female leaves her nest and they sneak in, lay an egg, kind of like a cowbird in a nest. So pretty soon, then you have the parents taking over the foster kids and like, whoa, this chick, this nestling doesn't look like me. It's gigantic and the wrong color. Well, too late. You've raised it. So the same sort of thing is happening with with these cuckoo bees.
Very cool. Um, so this is a little, I guess, a little less of a serious question. Do you think plants that evolved pollination strategies pre-bees kind of feel a little left out? Like I recently read that magnolia trees rely a lot on beetles. And do you think they're just like feeling just a little bit like, oh man, I don't have any bees to pollinate me? Like it's like they're just so good at it.
Yeah, well, bees are the champion pollinators, although there are about 200,000 other insect species out there around the globe that are pollinators, everything from flies to beetles to wasps to butterflies and moths. And you have floral adaptations happening both during the day and night. It's funny that you mentioned magnolia flowers. Um, Back in the dark ages when I was taking botany, the professors would always say, "Oh yeah, and the magnolias are the most primitive flowers," and um, the most primitive flowers were giants like magnolia, and wrong, they weren't. The earliest angiosperm flowers that we have found, some of them actually on the East Coast. There are some clay pits in New Jersey where some of these things have been preserved. And it turns out that back in the early Cretaceous, there were forest fires just like they're happening today. And when one of these fires came through, if there was litter, duff, I mean, fallen flowers and leaves and fruits on the forest floor, these things became burned. But if the fire passed through quickly enough, they were sort of um, what they call charcoalized. So basically, they were instantly turned into charcoal, and these became fossils. So you can retrieve these perfect specimens of these early Cretaceous flowers, maybe only 1 to 2 millimeters across. And botanists have been finding a lot more of these around the world. And so to fit with those little 1 or 2 millimeter wide flowers, there were other tiny insects, and some of the first bees uh, were small also. I know Brian Danforth and George Poinar published a number of years ago on one of these proto bees, the genus Meletos fex, and many people right now are combing through amber deposits, especially from uh, Myanmar, what was formerly Burma, and looking at some of the Cretaceous fossils there. So um, we have a lot of bee fossils in amber and even compression fossils. So Dominican Republic amber, amber from Mexico, compression fossils of bees and other pollinators from the Green River and Florissant beds in the southwestern US. And experts like Michael Engel have been spending a huge amount of their career studying, describing these new species and trying to figure out their taxonomy and phylogeny. So it's really fascinating. But we did have a lot of plants that predate angiosperms. So in the Jurassic, for example, we had cycads and benedictales and a lot of things, even some ferns and seed ferns that were producing pollen. And some of these had, if not floral nectaries, a lot of them had extra floral nectaries, like you see today on some ferns. So these early pollinators, way before bees, were visiting these plants and moving some pollen and spores around that resulted in fertilization and success of some of those early plants.
Okay, fantastic. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the community aspect and the societal aspect of bees. So, what I mean by that is a lot of our language surrounding bees is very like honeybee specific. And how do you feel that will change as people become more aware of how honeybees aren't the only type of bee? I think you already mentioned like ground nesting bees as these single mothers trying to put food on the table, but how else do you think the public's perception of bees could change?
Yeah, I'd like to see the public's perception, especially in the United States, change about bees. I give a lot of public lectures every year, and typically one of the questions I'll pose to the audience is, name some bees. What kind of bees do you know? And, hands all fly up. Honeybee, honeybee, honeybee. So, okay, what else? Oh yeah, those cute, charismatic black and white or black and yellow stripy ones, bumblebees. Okay. And so I keep probing and probing, and the really enlightened people in the audience might know about the big black carpenter bees. And then they'll say, oh yeah, they're eating my lumber. Or they'll say, oh, I was out working in my garden and I bent over and oh, my elbow, something stung me. So they might know four kinds of bees: honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, and sweat bees. And that's a lot. Most people just know about honeybees. And in the West, in Western societies, we have a severe entomophobia. Any little thing is a creepy crawly, and we think it's going to bite or sting us. And we naturally think that we're allergic to us and that one sting is going to kill us, when in fact, anaphylactic shock and venom allergy, things we know from the late great Justin Schmidt, the king of sting, um, it's really not that much of a problem if you're careful. As I said, unless you're one of the less than 1%, a few tenths of a percent of the public is actually allergic and should, carry an EpiPen or be careful when they're around stinging insects, especially near a bee nest, like a honeybee nest. But we really need to change the attitudes and basically get people to think about, hey, you like to eat. You'd like to eat, if you're lucky, like us in the US, 3 times a day. Well, about a third of that or so is coming to you directly or indirectly through the pollinating activity of bees, and not just honeybees, although honeybees are pretty much the de facto main pollinator of commercial agricultural crops, simply because it's so easy for beekeepers to make what's called a divide. They can turn one colony into two pretty quickly. And you can put 300 or 400 of these white Civil War Langstroth hive body beehives on the back of a semi trailer and move them around to pollinate crops. But native bees, especially those ground nesting bees, are the unsung heroines of pollination, and they literally fly under everybody's radar. So most of the time when I'm walking around leading a hike or something, I'll point out a native bee, and if it's not on a flower, or even if it is, most people will kind of recognize it as a wasp or something. So if a bee happens to be a strange color or not so fuzzy and not look like a bumblebee or a honeybee, they think it's a wasp or they don't know what it is. So um, I'm hopeful that a lot of things like GNBee and other programs, Bug Guide, and these things will get people to turn a corner and recognize these other bees for their value. I strongly urge people to join a conservation organization. There's some good ones out there. The Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation in Portland, Oregon. There's also the Pollinator Partnership based in San Francisco, or the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, NAPSI. All of these groups are doing phenomenal work at educating the public about the values of bees and the ecosystem services they provide. I mean, for example, everybody thinks about pollination. Well, pollinators do far more than pollinate. Uh, Pollinators, uh, not willingly, but they do anyway, sacrifice their bodies to feed other animals. So bees and other pollinators become food for lizards and spiders and other, well, mammals and other things that can eat them as part of global food chains. Also, when ground nesting bees make a nest, they're just like earthworms. We call this bioturbation. So when you think about all of the billions, trillions of bee nests in the ground, these are allowing water to infiltrate the soil. And guess what? All that food that mom brought in and fed to her larvae basically gets defecated out. So the larval bees will eat and eat and eat and generally defecate just at the very end of their lives. Not always true, but generally true. And those nitrogen rich feces stay in the ground. So bees are essentially uh, bees and wasps and other things that nest in the ground are essentially fertilizing and enriching the soil, which is something that most people don't think about at all.
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't considered it before. Now, you did mention conservation efforts like the Xerxes Society, and I wanted to ask, did you hear about I don't know if it's that recent, but the legislation surrounding bumblebees in California, or the ruling surrounding bumblebees in California?
Um, I have not. I'm aware of some of the bumblebee ordinances and things from a while ago. In fact, I and
Well,
the
I wanted to ask because recently I recently California kind of classified bumblebees as fish,
oh, right.
to help give them a conservation status. And I wanted to hear, in what ways can legislation, but also people work to do a better job at conserving bees.
Yeah, I think that first of all, we need to be smarter than, or the legislators need to be smarter than classifying bees as fish. But anyway, I think we need to,
Whatever gets the job done, I guess.
yeah, to straighten that out. But um, bees and other pollinators are under attack by so many things, and so many of these are anthropogenic of our own doing. Um, so there's a litany of bad chemicals, agrochemicals, insecticides, and herbicides that are applied to croplands. And let's face it, the love affair that American citizens have with their lawns, I think, is pretty disgusting. We need to reduce lawns and plant more pollinator meadows. Lawn care chemicals are horrendous and they get tracked into our houses and then sort of outgas indoors as sort of a sick building syndrome. And a lawn is a bee desert, right? So unless you let your lawn grow up tall and you have dandelions or other things blooming that will provide nectar and pollen for bees and other pollinators, of course, then if you let your lawn grow too long, you get a nasty weed notice like I do every year from my homeowners association and have to fight with them over that. Um, yeah, people should be planting far fewer lawns. And what people should be doing is planting for pollinators, but making sure that those plants are um, chemical free. For example, if you go to a big box store, you don't often know, but I would say in at least 50% of the cases, those plants are the soil and the plants themselves can be full of systemic insecticides. So they're in the tissues. So when you plant those things, the systemic insecticides show up in nectar and pollen and poison bees and other pollinators. Um, Also, it's no real fault of plant breeders, but artificial selection and plant breeders have been making flowers pretty for our sensibilities, but they've been inadvertently breeding out other things. I mean, when was the last time you smelled a really fragrant rose? I mean, they hardly exist. And often those roughly beautiful looking flowers have very limited amounts of nectar or pollen, sometimes none. So you can literally spend a fortune on buying sexy looking plants from a nursery, put them out into your garden. The pollinators show up and go, hey, where's the food? It's not there. So I like to caution people and recommend that they go to organic nurseries, or better yet, native plant nurseries, and buy plants that are adapted to your local soils and growing conditions, so that you'll end up spending far less money trying to take care of some sickly, maladapted plants that don't belong in your area anyway. And so you'll get the native pollinators coming in and they'll recognize those native plants. Um, One thing that Brian Danforth's group has found out through this group that we have at several universities looking at microbiomes, right? The helpful bacteria and fungi that are in adult and larval bee guts. I mean, scientists like Quinn McFrederick at Riverside, Rachel Vanette at Davis, Sean Steffen at Wisconsin, a number of other people. For decades, the chemical industry, especially the herbicide industry, has said, "Oh, well, herbicides kill weeds; they don't kill bees." I'll say two things. Well, first of all, if they're killing weeds, they're reducing nectar and pollen resources for bees, but more a lot more evil is in the system, because we now know that many of these herbicides are knocking out the beneficial microbiome in the larval bee guts. So, okay, if you bring certain herbicides into the lab, test them on adult bees, it has no effect. Really has no bearing on what's happening out in nature, because, as I said, now we're finding that not all, but some of these herbicides are having really bad effects on uh, knocking out the gut flora of these larval bees and causing either sublethal effects or outright mortality. So that's one example of where our ideas have really changed, and we have a much better understanding of the contribution of these microorganisms to bee health.
Yeah, fantastic, and just so important. And I guess since I have you for about the hour, and I don't wanna overstep on your time. As we reach the end here, is there any advice or direction you would give to people that want to get more involved with ground nesting bees and native bees? But maybe, you know, they're not out at that time of year. What are some other ways that people can kind of stay engaged with the science?
Sure. There are a number of ways that um, naturalists, citizen scientists, students, everybody really can stay engaged with pollinators. For example, even in the middle of winter, um, you can watch some nice natural history documentaries, right? Or pull up some YouTube videos on pollinators and get ready for spring to happen. I've already mentioned that, consider joining a hiking club or a conservation group or a local photo club. I think people become engaged and learn to appreciate, love, and protect something that they know about. So there's some really amazing, cool tools out there right now. A lot of them are apps on mobile phones, right? Cell phones. So you can go out and if you don't know birds, you can turn some apps on and they listening to the bird calls, the vocalization, and you can get some identifications. Or, as I said, you could take a photo of bees and other insects, butterflies. A lot of times there are some very inexpensive uh, macro lenses, simple lenses that will clip on to your existing cell phone camera and give you the ability to get up close and personal and take some better photos. And then those can be uploaded to like Jordan Kuhnemann's and Brian Danforth's GNBee.org, which uses iNaturalist as kind of its engine, or Project Bug Guide, or some of these others. So I would just encourage people to do that. If you really want to protect pollinators, try to plant for them. Try to use no or very few insecticides. If you have to spray an insecticide, hey, do it at night when the pollinators aren't active. That's a good start. Um, Maybe you want to invite some bees and wasps to come live in your yard. Well, in addition to just planting for them, you can take a piece of scrap lumber and just drill some holes into it, about 7 to 8 millimeters in diameter. You don't want to go through the back of the wood. You want it to be a hole, not a see-through tunnel. And you can nail those up in a garden on the outside of a garden shed or under the eaves of your house. And especially in the spring, summer, and into early fall, you'll get a lot of leafcutter, mason bees, and sometimes wasps that'll come in. And um, kids are really fascinated by these. Actually, kids of all ages. I like to call these pollinator pets. So you can watch them, and hey, it's better than reality TV.
And finally, what has it been like for you kind of discovering and seeing a community continue to grow surrounding ground nesting bees, native bees?
Yeah, over the 50 plus years actually that I've been playing around with bees, it's only gotten better. And to see other people involved in the studies, it's very heartening, not just collaborators and co-authors, but um, the general public as well. And I've mentioned these other things. I like to do a lot of educational outreach, not just for scientists or colleagues, but I'm talking about. I've actually written 10 books now. The latest was kind of my look at bee psychology, what a bee knows, from Island Press last year. And in that book, I talk about bee sensory systems and then bee learning and memory and compare and contrast social with solitary bees. Um, and even though I've written uh, some honeybee books, my first love are really the solitary um, ground nesting bees. Way back in 1996, I wrote a book with my good friend and ethnobotanist Gary Paul Nabhan, and that was called The Forgotten Pollinators, still in print. That was kind of our uh, clarion call, basically, that we would go around the world and we were seeing, even in 96, that pollinator populations, bees and other pollinators, were dropping. And in that book, we talk about some of the reasons. Unfortunately, um, it's gotten worse, not better, I have to say. So we've lost a huge amount of natural habitat uh, that was available for pollinators. So we need to try to work together to reverse those trends. Some things that we didn't I mean, we were mainly talking about insecticides and habitat destruction in that book, but a couple things right now that people need to be aware of, and several books have been written about it, and quite a few magazine articles. Night lighting, security lights around buildings attract billions, probably trillions of insects, which there was a paper that just came out about a month ago. For the first time, we now think we know the answer to the probably 2,000-year-old question of why moths are attracted to a flame, sometimes fatally. There's a group that brought some high-speed infrared cameras into the Costa Rican forest and tracked moths and other insects. And what seems to be happening is that they fly and try to keep their back to the light. So they'll get trapped going around this light. They also land on walls or the ground and they stay there. They can't get back up. Maybe they get too cold. The next morning, they're eaten by birds or lizards. So nocturnal lighting is a really potent danger for a lot of insects, and including some pollinators like moths and some others. One thing that I'd like to see a lot more research done on is the horrible effect of our roadways of not just eating up valuable nesting habitat for bees, but thinking of cars and trucks, the millions of them on our roadways, as giant organisms that are filter feeding, if you will, and that gunk on your windshield is sometimes a lot of bees and pollinators. So we're losing a huge amount of our insect biota due to just the fact that car and truck window shields and the rest of the vehicles are taking out huge numbers of insects. So I want to end on such a, a horrible note, but we do have a number of things that have gotten worse, and it's going to take a lot of us working with our elected legislators to try to turn things around. And I'm hopeful it can be done. We just need to start now, just like a lot of the climate change issues seem impossible. I think there are some workarounds, and if all of us become act just a little differently in our daily lives and pressure politicians to make the right choices, we'll have a much better world for ourselves, bees, other pollinators, and all wildlife.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, I think that is generally all the questions I had written down, and then a little bit of tangents. Is there anything you feel like we didn't cover that you would love to speak to, since yeah, we're still recording, or are you feeling
Sure. Let me
good?
just give you 30 seconds on my favorite pollination topic.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I consider myself a pollination biologist, which means I like to figure out the inner workings of how bees are attracted to flowers, how they see them, how they smell them. And my very favorite thing is what I call buzz pollination. So, for example, if you're a gardener, grab a tomato or eggplant flower, look at it with a hand lens, and you'll see little pores, little holes at the tips of the anthers. This is the only way that pollen can get out of that flower, even if you hold it upside down. So, what it takes is for a bumblebee or certain other bees, some of the ground nesting bees, or even like wood nesting carpenter bees, are really good at this. Honeybees are not, for whatever reason, we don't know, but honeybees cannot buzz pollinate. But let's say you have a bumblebee. The bumblebee will land on the tomato flower. She'll bite it with her mandibles and hang on for dear life. And then she uses her flight muscles in her thorax without flapping her wings. And this produces an audible buzz. It is as if the bee's body has become a living tuning fork. And literally within just a few tenths of a second, thousands or tens of thousands of pollen grains come blasting out of those anther tips in the form of a cloud of pollen grains, and it strikes the bee. The bee backs off and grooms its body and collects the pollen, and then will take it back to the nest and feed it to their brood. But um, this is something like it's been like a research magic well for me because I keep going back to it over and over again. And I started out as an undergraduate in college studying buzz pollination, and now I'm working with uh, biophysicists in Montana and other places, and we're figuring out exactly what the physical forces are. It turns out that bees develop through this strong buzz from their thoracic muscles. The frequency from about 100 to 400 cycles per second, and the amplitude and duration, the length of the buzz, are the things that cause the pollen to shoot out. But not all bees can do it, but we now know that there are dozens of bee genera around the world. Out of the 500 or so genera of bees that can do this. So if you like tasty blueberries, cranberries, eggplants, or tomatoes, hey, you're already a fan of buzz pollination.
And also, I just remembered since you introduced yourself while your background was still blurred, would you be able to just reintroduce yourself kind of briefly?
Sure.
And then I'll just cut it and put it at the front.
Sure.